الله على أعدائهم أجمعين أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن الناس من يتخذ من دون الله أندادا يحبونهم كحب الله والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله صلوات على محمد وآل محمد وآل محمد. We have been discussing the art of yearning for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the basis of our discussion has been this verse of the Quran, chapter 2, verse 165, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, and amongst people there are some who take for themselves objects of worship besides God, and they love them as they ought to have loved God, whereas the believers, they are intense in their love for Allah. We have almost come to a conclusion now, and inshallah tomorrow night we will start discussing the conclusion. If there is any bit left, we will inshallah cover that on Saturday night. Tonight we want to complete our discussion on what practical steps we can undertake in our lives so as to soften our hearts and remove the various forms of materialisms that creep in without our knowledge, so that with this softening of the heart and this preparation of the heart, we can experience a yearning for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or feel His love in our hearts. So last night we completed discussing how to recite du'as, and we talked about Salatul Layl. Tonight we want to move on to another important aspect of softening the heart, and that is the importance of not eating excessively. You will recall, in terms of practical steps, we used the verse of Quran, chapter 2, verse 45, which says, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, and seek help from Allah with patience and with prayers. And we said patience in tafsir here refers to fasting. So, in terms of the harms of eating excessively, I will once again refer to the Misbah al-Sharia of Imam Jaffer al-Sadiq alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We used this reference on the very first night when we defined what yearning is about. Here's the sixth Imam alayhi salam when discussing eating. He says, there is nothing more harmful to the heart of a believer than having too much food. For it brings about two things. It hardens the heart, and it causes an arousal of desires. And the Messenger of Allah, peace be on him and his family, said, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, the son of Adam does not fill any worse vessel than his belly. And Dawood alayhi salam said, leaving a morsel of food that I need is preferable to me than staying up for 20 nights. So he's comparing that sometimes giving up food is 20 times more difficult than even worshipping Allah in the night. But at the same time, its effect is that much more profound. What you can attain in terms of softening the heart, sometimes with one day of fasting, can be equal to what you would attain if you kept eating to your fill and stayed at night worshipping Allah for 20 nights. And in another hadith, also hadith al-Nabawi, we are told, a mu'min eats with one stomach, whereas a munafiq eats with 7 stomachs. And what this means is that a munafiq eats 7 times that of a mu'min. And you will find also people who are more attached to this world, they are obsessed about eating all the time. In another actually hadith from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam regarding eating, he says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, man kana hammuhu batnuhu kana qimatuhu ma kharaja minhu. One whose constant concern is eating, his value is what comes out from him. In other words, his value is what he excretes, because that is what he values, that is his constant preoccupation day and night. What can I eat? What can I eat? What else can I eat? And Isa alayhi salam says, the heart does not have any worse disease than hardness. And there is no soul that is more weakened than by the lack of hunger. So Eating is something that we can talk about for a whole session and its harms. And it is wrong to judge another person. Of course, everyone knows their own capacity and their own limitation. But we are our best judge as to when am I eating out of hunger and when am I eating out of greed. And when am I full and when am I overeating. Again, if you go to a mujtahid and you're walking the fine line and asking about halal and haram, the only thing your mujtahid will tell you is if it's halal food, you can eat as much as you want. You have to come into the levels of iman and spirituality where then the question in irfan, ahsant, where it comes into the issue of saying it is makruh to overeat. One common tendency people have is when there's a little bit left, it says, this will go to waste, just finish it. So instead of using the garbage can, you use your stomach to dispose of whatever is left. So we are full, we are no longer hungry, we don't want to eat, but because it will get thrown, so just finish it. And there is also a hadith that says, do not make your stomachs a cemetery for animals. Because some people eat, not only overeat, but they want to eat meat as well. لا تجعلوا بطونكم مقابر للحيوان. Do not make your stomach a maqbara for hayawan. And a variety of animals, not just one. So even though Islam strongly condemns waste and throwing away food, if you have to choose between your stomach and the garbage can, leave your stomach. Because that is wrong, this is wrong, but this will affect your spirituality, this will affect your iman. And in this day and age with refrigerators and so on, there is usually no reason to throw the food. But there is also no reason to overeat. So enough said on that subject, inshallah, and we are our own best judge. The other important aspect of seeking spirituality and trying to soften the heart is solitude. And we have been mentioning this time and again that those who seek spirituality are usually torn between these two things, whereas on one hand they wish to be isolated so that they can spend some time alone in meditation and worship of Allah. And on the other hand, Islam does not allow them monasticism or to cut themselves away from society. So there is a delicate balance that they have to constantly juggle between the two. Islam does provide some means of relief, such as allowing you to perform i'tikaf in a mosque, or encouraging you to pray Salatul Layl in the middle of the night. But nonetheless, this is a constant challenge. The key important thing is that one should try and strive to reach a level where one does not need people to be happy, where one can find more pleasure in being alone worshipping Allah than in being in social gatherings and being surrounded by people. Most people cannot do that. Most people cannot stay alone at home. The moment they're alone, they'll phone someone, talk to someone, go out of the house. If they can't do that, switch on the television, occupy themselves, but they can't sit alone. It bothers them, it depresses them. Whereas what we are talking about here is that it is quite possible for a person to enjoy being alone if they learn to recognize Allah's presence as a company. So for example, in one hadith, which is in Uddatul Da'i as well, of Allama Hilli, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to the Prophet Musa and says, Ya Musa, al-faqir man laysa lahu mithli kafil. O Musa, poor is he who does not have me for a guardian. Wal-marid man laysa lahu mithli tabib. And sick is he who does not have me for a physician. Wal-gharib man laysa lahu mithli munis. And a stranger is truly he who does not have me for a companion. So there are levels of spirituality, and at one point one realizes the truth of this hadith. And those who have attained that level, they realize that truly if you have Allah, then you are in good hands and you have company. Whereas if you are estranged from Allah, then you are always a stranger even if you're surrounded by people. That is why, for example, Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, she is one of those women who have been described as the 4 great women of paradise. After the daughter of the Prophet and his wife Khadija alayhi salam, we have Maryam, the mother of the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. Asiya alayhi salam in the Quran, when she prays to Allah even for Jannah, she says, رَبِّ ابْنِي لِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. Oh Allah, build for me with you a house in paradise. This is a fine point here. Ayatollah Jawad Amuli in his tafsir of Quran on this verse, he makes a point. He says, notice that she did not say first, give me a house in Jannah with you. She said, give me a house with you in Jannah. And he says there is a big difference between Jannatin tajri min tahtiha al-anhar and indaka baytan fil Jannah. One is the ordinary Jannah beneath which rivers flow. This is a Jannah with Allah, meaning she valued the presence and the intimate communication with Allah even more than the Jannah. And in one dua from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says, Allahumma innaka anisul anisin li awliyaik. O Allah, you are the best of all companions. You are the most intimate of all companions for your friends. In awhashtahumul ghurba anasahum dhikrak. If they ever feel lonely, then they feel the pleasure of your company by remembering you. وَإِن صُبَّتْ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَصَائِبُ لَجَأُوا إِلَى الْإِسْتِجَارَةُ بِكَ. And if they are ever surrounded by afflictions, they come running to you for protection. So again here the Imam is expressing the same thing. And that is why if you look at Nahj al-Balagha, that famous khutbah of the qualities of a mu'min, that the Imam talks to Himam and explains to him what are the qualities of a believer. At the end of that we are told the Himam or Humam, he actually faints, he collapses and passes away because he cannot take it anymore. The way the Imam describes the qualities of a muttaqi, of one who is pious, they have such an impact on him that it overwhelms him. He collapses and he passes away. And then later on the Imam talks about this, and at one point he says, if it was not for the fact that there is something like destiny where it is written for everyone when they will die, a believer's soul would not be able to stay in the body out of their shauq for Allah. Out of their yearning for Allah, the soul is like a caged bird. It flutters and is restless within, wanting to leave the body and ascend towards the heaven in search of proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the kind of feeling we want to experience within ourselves. But unfortunately this cannot be if our solace and our comfort comes from people. That is why we have one hadith from Imam Ali alayhi salam. He says, كيف يأنس بالله من لا يستوحش من الخلق. How can one feel close to Allah when one has not yet learned to detach from the people? When we are still so dependent on our social company and social gatherings and mixing with people, that is still so important to us for our survival, how can we even start experiencing what it means to love Allah? In a similar hadith from Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, he says, Alamatul uns billah al-wahshatu min al-nas. He says, the sign of a person having attained some relationship, some closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is their detachment from people. You will recall on the first night as well, we said that those who yearn for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will see that in their lives, they have friends, they have relatives, but they're not overly obsessed about any one particular relationship with creatures, because the relationship they value the most is their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are some of the steps that we can look at in terms of softening the heart. In summary, if you look at all this variety of traditions, you will see there is a mix that is required to first prepare, that one needs to first look at one's life and simplify it a little bit, eat a little less, sleep a little less, talk a little less, be less worldly in one's way of life, and then increase one's worship and one's dhikr of Allah to get that desired effect. And that is why we have one famous hadith that says, إِذَا أَحَبَّ اللَّهُ عَبْدًا أَهَمَّهُ بِالثَّلَاثَةِ. When Allah loves a person, He makes him concerned about three things. قِلَّةُ الطَّعَامِ وَقِلَّةُ الْمَنَامِ وَقِلَّةُ الْكَلَامِ. Eating less, talking less, and sleeping less. So this is all, and perhaps that is why it rhymes, so it's easy to remember. Ta'am, manam, and kalam. That when Allah loves a person, you will begin to see these signs in him or her. That they will naturally begin to lose interest in too much sleeping and too much eating. And these are the things that really hold holds us hostage in terms of our desires. What I want to do to end, I'm not ending right away, but moving towards the end for tonight so that I can start on the conclusion tomorrow, inshallah, is so far all the pieces of advice that I have shared with you have been my personal research, whatever little I could find from books. I have taken them from various sources and pieced them together and said to you that, this can be done or that can be done. But in order to add to that and validate it further, I want to share some direct advice from other individuals so that we can see that even though I took these different pieces from various sources, they ultimately are influenced by the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in the same way. And these are direct pieces of advice for people who want to gain higher levels of spirituality. So I'm going to quote first some advice from Imam Jaffer al-Sadiq alayhi salam, which is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And then I would like to quote some advice from 2 or 3 different maraji and mujtahideen, some famous scholars in our madhab, and see what they have to say about people who are trying to purify themselves and experience this yearning for Allah. So first, from the 6th Imam alayhi salam, there are 2 or 3 different narrations. In the first narration, he talks about how to be more diligent when you say your prayers in order to attain more spirituality. He says, when you face the Qibla, you should despair of this world and what it contains of creation and what others are occupied with. Empty your heart of every preoccupation which might distract you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. See the immensity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with your innermost being, and remember that you will one day stand before Him. When you recite the takbir, that means that first takbiratul ihram, when you say Allahu Akbar, you should belittle whatever is in the high heavens and in the moist earth. That means forget the world and all it contains. The moment you say Allahu Akbar, forget everything else. Anything which is below His glory. For when Allah looks, this is from the 6th Imam, he says, when Allah looks into the heart of His slave who is saying takbir, and He sees in his or her heart something obstructing the truth in his declaring that Allah is the greatest, then Allah says to the person who is praying, "O liar, are you trying to deceive me? By my might and my majesty, I will deny you the sweetness of my remembrance, and I will veil you from my nearness and from the joy of my intimate communion." That means Allah should not find you standing before Him and saying Allahu Akbar. What does Akbar mean? Akbar means greater or greatest. Akbar is actually the superlative of Kabir. So in the language of the ordinary people, Allahu Akbar means Allahu Akbar min kulli shay. Allah is greater than everything else. In the language of the Urafa, there is even a higher level than that, because the Arif says in reality there is no reality except Allah. So how can anything be compared to Allah and be said to be Allah is greater than everything else when everything else is nothing before Him? So Allah is not Akbar min kulli shay. Allahu Akbar min an yusaf. Allah is greater than anyone's ability to describe Him. So they define Allahu Akbar differently. They say it's not Allah is greater than everything else. It's Allah is greater than anyone's capacity to define and describe Him. So when you do Allahu Akbar, Allah should not find in our heart even the slight attachment or feeling of something else being equally important or something that will compete for our attention with Allah. Because then He says to us, You are lying. Are you trying to deceive me? I will deny you the sweetness of my love if you do that. Know that Allah does not need your service. So then the Imam goes on to talk about how Allah is independent of you. He doesn't need you. It is you who needs Him, and He is doing you a favor by allowing you to stand before Him and worship Him. This is an excellent book for those of you who, you should try and get a copy of this. It's in English, and I don't think it's even more than $10, Lantern of the Path. It is believed to have been written by the sixth Imam himself. So it's definitely the #1 book you want to have for people who want to better themselves spiritually. Then there is another piece of advice from the sixth Imam alayhi salam concerning resting. How does a believer rest? We said the other day that a mu'min loves to exhaust himself in the service of Allah. He doesn't like too much comfort. The sixth Imam alayhi salam says, a believer only acquires true rest when he will meet Allah. Although he may rest by 4 different things. 1, silence, by which you recognize the state of your heart and yourself in your relationship to your Creator. 2, retreat, by which you are rescued from the evils of the times, outwardly and inwardly. 3, hunger, which kills fleshy appetites and temptation. And 4, wakefulness, which illuminates your heart and purifies your nature and cleanses your spirit. So you can see now that the advice coming from the sixth Imam alayhi salam is also in a very similar vein to what we have been discussing, that wakefulness and hunger and some degree of seclusion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and silence as well are all important factors. One last piece of advice again from the sixth Imam alayhi salam. This comes actually from a man called Unwan Basri, and this is another very good book. I'm using English books on purpose because I know there are many here who are not familiar with Arabic. This book is Self-Building by Ayatollah Amini, and there is in fact a copy right here for those who want to take a look at it even later on. There is a whole section on different pieces of advice and instruction. This man, Unwan Basri, he's a 94-year-old man, and he's struggling to make himself spiritually better. So he comes to speak to the sixth Imam alayhi salam and asks him for some advice. And it's a lengthy tradition, but I'll jump to the pieces that I want to quote here. At one point, the sixth Imam alayhi salam refers to this Unwan Basri, and he calls him Abu Abdullah. He says to him, "O Abu Abdullah, knowledge cannot be acquired by learning. Rather, real knowledge is light which illuminates a person's heart who is blessed with Allah's guidance. Therefore, if you are the seeker of knowledge, first make your heart comprehend the reality of what it is to be Allah's servant. And then request for knowledge by means of your deeds. In other words, act on the little that you know and Allah will give you more. And ask Allah for comprehension so that you can understand." So this Unwan al-Basri asks the Imam, what does it mean to be a true servant of Allah? And the Imam says, to be a true servant of Allah lies in 3 things. The first thing is that you should not consider yourself to be the owner of anything you possess. The second thing is that you should consider yourself to be absolutely helpless in managing your own affairs. And the third is that you should constantly engage yourself in obeying Allah and keep away from disobeying Him. And the reason for these 3 things, the Imam explains, is that if a person does not consider anything he or she possesses to be his own or her own, if you don't consider yourself to be the owner of your wealth, if you don't consider the property that you own to be yours, then spending it in the way of Allah will be easier for you. Because you realize, it's not mine, I'm just a keeper for it, I'm just a trustee for it. And if a person feels helpless in managing their own affair, then they will trust Allah to manage their affairs. And then they will find it easier to tolerate the hardships of this world. And if a person constantly engages in good and keeps away from sins, then their precious free time will not be wasted in nonsense amusements. That is another very important thing. They say, if you want to know the value of a person, if you want to know an individual, what is his worth? The simplest way to find out the worth of a person is find out what does the person do with their free time. Because everybody eats, everybody sleeps, everybody has to go to work, everybody has to go to school, everybody has to go grocery shopping, everybody comes to the mosque and prays. These are things we all do. Then there is some free time. There is some time that we have of our own. You can tell the value of a person when you know what does this person do with his free time. That will tell you whether that person has any goals in life, whether that person is more inclined to the hereafter or this world, whether that person is enslaved by his or her desires. What is it that obsesses us? What is it that we yearn to do when we are free and on our own? Then the sixth Imam alayhi salam gives other pieces of advice to Unwan al-Basri. For example, he tells him, do not eat anything unless you are hungry. Do not eat anything in particular unless you feel an appetite for it. When you eat something, always make sure you are taking the name of Allah and what you are eating is halal. If someone says to you, if you say something to me, I will say 10 sentences to you. You say to him, if you say 10 sentences to me, I will not even say one sentence to you. In other words, the Imam is teaching us how to control our anger. Then he says to him, if someone threatens you with an abusive language, you be polite and try and advise him. If someone accuses you falsely of something you haven't done, then say to him, if what you say is true, may Allah forgive me. And if what you say is wrong, may Allah forgive you. So the Imam teaches him all these things. When you don't know something, ask those who are more learned than you. But do not ask them questions with the intention of examining them and trying to test their knowledge. Avoid issuing your own fatwas and religious decrees, because by doing that, you are offering your neck as a bridge for people to cross. This is very important. That's why I told you the other day when people ask me questions like, why is music haram and why is this and why is that, I tell them, go ask your mujtahid. Because sometimes people know the answer. But the reason they ask you is because they want you to validate it for them and tell them it's okay, Allah will forgive you. Don't ever fall into that trap. The simple answer is, I will not let you use my neck as a bridge so that you cross into paradise and I fall into the fire of hell. Now, keeping in mind the limited time we have, there is some advice from Allama Majlisi. Allama Majlisi is the compiler of Biharul Anwar, one of our greatest works, and we have a lot of other works from him. We are indebted to him, undoubtedly. He also attained high levels of ma'rifah. And again, I would advise you to go and read this in this book, but here he talks about a spiritual experience he had where he says one night he was half asleep, half awake, and he saw the Messenger of Allah, peace be on him, and his family in a dream. And he said, this was an opportunity for me to look at him closely, and I thought, let me look at the Prophet closely and see, how perfect he is in every way. And he says, the more I looked at him, the more there was this nur that expanded and filled the room. And he says, it made me realize, he said, I had a sudden realization that in fact the Quran is nothing but a manifestation of the akhlaq of the Prophet. And he says, the more attention I paid to the Prophet, the more I could understand the Quran. And he says, even after I had this dream, I found that now whenever I reflect on verses of the Quran, I had this deep understanding from a place I never imagined. And he explains it very beautifully here. And he says, of course, this incident cannot be appreciated by many people, but my aim is to advise my fellow believers. So he then gives some advice and says how you can attain, that level of spirituality. And again, he advises, he says, avoid useless talk, avoid living a luxurious life, eating too much, spending too much on your food and your clothes. Avoid too much social mixing and social gatherings where the talk is just worldly and sinful, or even if it's not sinful, he says, avoid any talk where Allah's remembrance is not included. Try to keep the company of people who are closer to Allah so they constantly remind you of Allah. And then he says that some people have said that if you constantly recite Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum, it is very helpful in your spiritual development. Allama Majlisi says, I myself have found just saying Ya Allahu, Ya Allahu, Ya Allahu frequently has greatly helped me increase in my spirituality. He says if this is done for a period of 40 days, day and night continuously, then certainly the doors of wisdom and learning and love will be open to the person and enable him to ascend to the most exalted Gnostic positions. So that is his experience. And then there is, again, very quickly, I apologize for taking another 5-10 minutes, but I want to complete this subject tonight. Mullah Hussein Quli Hamadani, another famous scholar, he talks about the importance of staying in the state of wudu at all times and avoid attending meetings and gatherings where there is a possibility of sins being committed, even if the socialization is not sinful, but it's of people who are negligent about the hereafter. Too much humor, too much nonsense talking, all injures your heart. He talks about the importance of staying up on Thursday nights and reciting Surah Al-Qadr 100 times between Thursday night and Friday afternoon. I want to end with some advice from Ayatollah Mirza Jawad Agha Maliki Tabrizi. Ayatollah Jawad Maliki Tabrizi was a very well-known Arif, and if you speak to any student from Qum, they will speak of him in very high words, and he didn't pass away too long ago, but his books are very well known. They're all Irfani. There is another book of his that I will use inshallah tomorrow and day after called Sulukul Arifan, in which he talks particularly about spiritual struggling in the month of Ramadan, and it's available in English as well. It's called Spiritual Journeying of the Mystics in the month of Ramadan or something like that. And his advice is that when you perform sajda, prolong your sajda as much as you can, not in your salat only, but even your mustahab, your last sajda of shukr, or whenever you get a chance to do sajda, make sure it is as long as possible. And he says that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam used to recite 1,000 times in sajda, La ilaha illallahu haqqan haqqa, La ilaha illallahu ta'abbudan wa riqqa, La ilaha illallahu imanan wa sidqa. That there is no God but Allah, truly and justly. There is no God but Allah, and I bow in humility before Him. There is no God but Allah, and the truth indeed, and this is the truth and my faith. And then he says that when he was staying in Najaf al-Ashraf, he once asked a Marja Taqleed who was very pious, that give me some advice that will help me make myself better spiritually. And he says the Marja said to him that try and prolong your sajda, and in the sajda try and say, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. There is no God but you. Glory be to you. Surely I have been of the unjust ones. And he says when you do this, try and focus your attention on the fact that it is not Allah who has been unfair to me, but rather I have been unfair to myself. I have injured and hurt myself. And he says there were students of this Marja who would do this 1,000 times in sajda, and there were some who would do it 3,000 times. But this is known to be a cure or something that has really helped people attain high levels of spirituality. La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. This is the dua of the Prophet Yunus alayhi salam when he was in the belly of the fish. So we stop here for tonight, and inshallah we will continue with the conclusion tomorrow. In light of the fact that this is Thursday night, I would just like to recite a few words of Masa'ib, because it is highly recommended that we remember Aba Abdullah al-Hussein on a night like this. If you can please recite aloud, Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, ala Muhammad, ala Muhammad. Imam Hussein alayhi salam is very special to those who seek spirituality and those who struggle to better themselves spiritually, based on his du'as, based on his lifestyle, based on, and this is true for all Imams, but from Imam Hussein alayhi salam, there are some words that he said in Karbala that really are moving and of a very high importance to the Urafa. There was one great Arif, Ibn Tawus, I believe, who compiled one of the early books of du'as, from which Sheikh Abbas Qumi compiled Mafatihul Jinan and so on. He says in one of his books, he says that Hussein alayhi salam on the day of Ashura, he attained his uruj, he reached levels of spirituality that human beings can never imagine. And he says the levels that Hussein reached on the day of Ashura were so lofty that if it was not for the fact that from a human perspective it was a calamity and a tragedy, He says on the day of Ashura we would dress as if it is Eid, in celebration of the levels that Hussein reached on the day of Ashura. This is the level of Abu Abdullah in the other world. And the more we struggle, the more Allah will test us. That testing has dual purposes. On one hand, it weans us off the world. On the other hand, it tests what we are made of and how far we can go. When you think about it, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, everything was against him on the day of Ashura. The people were against him. The weather was against him. His body, in terms of hunger and thirst, was against him. The emotional drain of having to separate from his family was against him. Losing his brother, losing his children, losing his companions, all that was against him. And yet he stood firm and did not waver even for a moment. A small example we see is how the moment when he is leaving for his final journey to the Maqtal, and he has to reason with his 4-year-old daughter, Sakina alayhi salam. And Sakina is insisting to her father that everyone who has gone has not come back. Why can't you stay with me? For a child to be attached like that, because we are told Sakina alayhi salam, when she used to sleep at night, she used to sleep on the chest of Hussein. And she wouldn't sleep unless she was with her father. So now Hussein alayhi salam is trying to explain to Sakina that my daughter, I have to go and die. The immensity of this moment, if we can just capture this, Miranis tries to capture this in a few verses that I want to share with you. He says that Sakina alayhi salam first says to her father, she says, "Neend aayegi jab aapki boo paungi baba. Main raat ko maqtal mein chali aaungi baba." I will only sleep, my dear father, when I can smell your fragrance, when you are near me. And if you have to go to the maqtal, I will come running to you in the middle of the night. Hussein is still trying to console Sakina. Farmaya nikalti nahi saidaniya bahar, chhati pe sulayegi tumhe raat ko madar. Oh Sakina, little girls do not come out into the desert in the middle of the night. You must sleep with your mother tonight. And Hussein is trying to explain this little girl. Usne kaha fir aaj kaha soenge asghar. Asghar sleeps with my mother. If I am to sleep with him, with my mother, where will Asghar sleep tonight? Sheikh bole ke bas zid na karo sadke mein tum par. Shab hoegi aur dasht mein hum hoenge bibi. Asghar mere saath aaj wahan soenge bibi. Oh Sakina, you sleep with your mother tonight and Asghar will sleep with me in the plains of Karbala. This is Hussein. He left towards the battlefield, calling out to Allah. In his final moments, he is praying to Allah and expressing his yearning for Allah. This is the dua of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Taraktul khalqa turran fi hawak. Oh Allah, I have abandoned all creation out of my love for you. Wa aitamtul iyal likay arak. And I have accepted that my children should become orphans just so that I can come and see you. وَلَوْ قَطَّعَنِي فِي الْحُبِّ إِرْبًا لَمَا حَنَّ الْفُؤَادَ سِوَاكَ. And if I was to be cut in